Everyone. Thank you so much for being here. We are having a few technical difficulties, but just bear with us because, what is a professional facilitator if not trying to also moderate at the same time? But no, just kidding. We'll definitely have some help along the way. Just because of time, what I'm going to do is just go ahead and get started, if that's all right with everybody that is just now getting on. Thank you all for being here. So my name is Colleen
Colleen,
Smith. Yeah.
If you don't mind, I'll just say a couple things. So
Please.
again, apologize for whatever technical issue we're having, but thankfully Colleen has stepped up to the plate. So thank you. Just so everyone knows, this session is being recorded. We appreciate your attendance for the participation. We do have a hard stop in 50 minutes. And so the less I talk, the more Colleen can talk. So I'm going to hand it over to Colleen. We didn't talk about how Colleen would like to respond to questions, but if you want to, you can put questions in the chat, and then I'll leave it to Colleen to explain how she would like to handle those. So again, thank you, and welcome, Colleen.
Thank you so much. Live things are always a fun experiment to get through. So as you said, my name is Colleen Smith. I'm here doing a workshop on developing inclusive online learning environments for high impact practices. I'll probably take questions at the end, but if there are like smaller questions throughout, I think that would be beneficial. I'll definitely make sure to put my slides and resources and links and everything in the Discord for everyone to follow along later on. I actually have a resources link to a Google Doc to let you all copy all of the resources that we're going to be talking about today. So don't feel like you have to fiercely, screenshot everything and then make sure that you're saving stuff. I've already been doing that in some of the sessions, even though people have been telling me that some of the presentation resources are going to be coming. So again, thank you all for being here. I'm actually a doctoral student at Florida State University, and my research is currently looking at how higher education staff, like administrators, create inclusive online spaces for historically underserved, first generation, and low-income students. So just a tiny bit about me. I have a bachelor's in computer graphics, a master's in counselor education, and I'm currently job searching since I am like 2 weeks away from being ABD in my doctoral journey, and I'm very excited about it. I feel as though I'm going to get my life back, and I'm very just relieved that I'm getting to this point. But I decided to focus on inclusive learning design for high impact practices because of my background with a lot of several grant funded programs that were focused on maybe like undergraduate research, ePortfolio development, individual development plans, and some of those joint academic pursuits for students. But I'm really glad that you all are here today. And I'm very glad for this conference because I believe that I'm actually, oh, we have more people entering the waiting room. Sorry about that. Forgive me, everyone who is just coming from the waiting room. I wanted to make sure that you all were here for the most important part. No, just kidding. But for our land acknowledgement. So since I'm affiliated with Florida State University, I wanted to give a little bit more space for this land acknowledgement that we've been all talking about how to incorporate it. That's not like right before the presentation. However, I'm doing that. The reason why I want to do this is because I want to open up the space and give the space to talk about advocacy. Recently, Florida State University student government has vetoed a bill to recognize an official land acknowledgement for the entire university. And even though the university is located on the land and territory of multiple indigenous nations and tribes, I wanted to give light to the student-run initiative and the student-written initiative land acknowledgement to just make sure that we are sharing the platforms that we can in order to more waiting room people. I'm so glad you're here. Thank you all for being here. But I wanted to give more space to having the land acknowledgement, but then also discussing the advocacy that is still needing to happen in higher education. All right, so we all remember March 2020, right? I'd love to know if you are coordinating or managing a high impact practice, or if you have a high impact practice in one of your courses, how did you pivot exactly to go from maybe in person to online, or thinking about this distance education piece? And if you care to share in the chat with us, I'd love to hear how you all are, or how you all pivoted, 2 years ago. So for me, we'll go through a lot of that, but for me, I remember I was actually on maternity leave in March 2020. And I joke with people all the time, and I say that, yeah, I left on maternity leave and never went back, even though I was still working. So what's been interesting is that I actually first created this presentation in 2021 for the division that I was working for at the time at the University of Central Florida, who I was working for at that moment. And it was like a professional development training workshop. I was a graduate school preparation advisor and working alongside the McNair Scholars Program, running a peer mentor program and heading digital learning initiatives for their office. And this workshop was a way to almost chronicle the struggles that we had to deliver content and resources to our students in a way that was inclusive and caring. I mean, I think that's the hardest part, like we did pre-pandemic. And especially when the high impact practice that you're trying to translate online is not a formal structure like a course where you can just require attendance, or we had to get a little bit more creative to define a more inclusive space online for students. So I think high impact practices are unique in that they can happen in a course or they can happen outside of a course, but how you implement those high impact practices in an inclusive way and a caring way and an empathetic way is a chance for all of us to rethink about how we do things. Yeah, I see. Someone is sharing we received a message later that day that our team has put on as many courses and content online as possible within the next week. Whew, a week. That seems to be a lot. So just to set the stage for some of you who may not be familiar exactly with high impact practices, but HIPs, HIPs, however you want to call them, are educational practices that research has shown to increase rates of student retention, engagement, persistence to graduation for all students across diverse backgrounds. And I've added some examples here on the slide of some of those high impact practices. However, what I'm going to do is put a link in the chat that can give you a lot longer list of high impact practices that are recognized by AAC&U, the American Association of Colleges and Universities. So in true duck form, I attended a free online workshop. This online workshop was given by the John N. Gardner Institute, and the research found that historically, high impact practices are experiences that are usually reserved for those higher income backgrounds. So historically, if you think about internships, they're normally not paid, or study abroad usually costs a lot of money, right? But what they also found was that these experiences are also found to be disproportionately helping white students more above those students who are from historically underrepresented races or ethnicities. And, the John Gardner Institute is starting to look at ways on how to do a socially just redesign of high impact practices or success initiatives within higher education and universities. So because there is a gap of research for inclusive online high impact practices, I then started to look at the other side of the problem, which is how inclusive instructional design plays a role in translating HIPs to an online space. So what I found was that the foundational literature that identified this they found it way back in the 90s, like 30 years ago. And inclusive design should incorporate all social, cultural, economic, and historical perspectives in its content and learning activities, and not just the perspective of the instructional designer or the one person that's actually creating the environment. So I basically found that we've had this issue for a while now, and it's not just something that's become an issue because of the pandemic, but I do think it's been magnified because of the pandemic. But now I think we're all ready. We're past that pre-contemplation stage, and we're about to start to make that change. I think we're ready to make the changes to our high impact practices to make them more welcoming and inclusive spaces for our diverse students. Now, because I'm curious and interested in redefining in some of our processes and structures, because I'm a troublemaker, I dove a little bit deeper into some of the research and practices, because this is kind of like an interdisciplinary issue. So I wanted to come up with some of these examples. So there's a lot of names for what we're trying to do in the research, but I've pulled just 4 concepts that I think can contribute to it. And the first one is cross-cultural instruction. So most of this research shows that the perceived environment matters for historically underrepresented students in higher education. The next piece of the research and those implications for culturally responsive teaching is that normally teachers, instructors, faculty believe culturally responsive teaching is important, but they lack the knowledge to actually implement those tenets of culturally responsive teaching. Next, the concept of universal design for learning, which I believe we're all most familiar with, but this advocates for one design that's accessible for everyone of all abilities, conditions, and backgrounds. And it's difficult to think outside of your own worldview, right? And then next is a little bit more recent, and it's called equity-minded design. So it's mostly about those active actions that you take during the program or during the course, depending on what you're trying to do. But it's basically these active actions that you ensure that all participants, regardless of circumstances or their identities, are able to participate in a virtual space in a valuable way that helps them achieve their academic goals. Darlene, thank you. It isn't just one design, it's choices and options. Thank you so much. I appreciate that. All right, so then the next one is when we start looking into the research to practice in multiple disciplines, it's saying kind of the same thing, that when we create online learning environments, we as the designers can't separate our culture or our worldview from the design. So what can we do to develop a more inclusive online learning space for those diverse learners? And I have this magic elixir for you, the 5 tips to develop inclusive online environments for your high impact practices. All right, so the first one is work on your own cultural competence. We've talked about cultural humility in some of the past presentations already, but to help you as the designer or the creator of the online environment, we need to first distinguish how to insert more of those social, cultural, economic, and historical perspectives in the content and learning activities. You need to be aware of what your own perspectives are in the world and what your worldview is and how that may differ from other perspectives. So simply stated, it's to do the work. Now, in order to do the work, I have a lot of examples on some of these slides. Again, reminder that all these resources I have put on these slides that has a lot of information on it will be in the resources that I share later on in the link. So really don't worry about most of it. But one of the things that I wanted to talk to you all about is this National Seed Program. This is a program for I think cohorts of people who want to have open and honest conversations to be able to explore their own identities and how that intersects with other people's experiences. So the driver for the SEED program, which they can institute at any organization at your home institution is to just drive personal, institutional, and societal change towards social justice. So it's a really cool project, but what I'll do is share the link for you in the chat again, so that if you'd like to kind of check it out or head it up or see if your organization has this, that would be a way to start trying to do the work. There's also some free online trainings, a lot on YouTube, and then you'll probably read about this, share blogs, or other perspectives through social media or things of that nature. I mean, you all are obviously interested in learning about this, so you're already doing some of the work that I'm talking about. But the point is that you need to spearhead that part of your development, because a new perspective isn't just going to come knocking at your door. You do the work to understand what other perspectives are out there and how they may be beneficial to the learners in your high impact practices. All right. So one of the examples is this book that I just ordered. I have yet to read it, but I just ordered on Amazon, and I'm very excited to read it. I know it comes from a K-12 perspective, but in reading some of the reviews and why I decided to buy this book, it said that it was very applicable to higher education, not just courses, but also recreating structures and rethinking things. So coming from a place like Florida, where anti-racism and critical race theory is almost illegal, I want to take it upon myself to learn more about it so that I can start to create it within my processes. But the whole point is not just this book, it is the fact that we should be looking for blogs, we should be looking for online articles, we should be looking for podcasts in order to learn more about this cultural competence, and also have this humility to say that our work is never done. You know, I'll create this presentation and I'm going to continue to revamp it in order to make it better, especially what Darlene pointed out as for UDL, which is not really cultural humility, but it's humility in the fact that no one person is an expert in everything, right? So I'm also going to put one more link in the chat about, and this is my list of resources. Feel free to make a copy of this Google Doc for yourself and to keep it in your own records. What I'm going to do is also share that link at the end. So don't feel like you have to do multiple things, but if you want to open it up, you can. All right, so this is an example of the YouTube training. So since I come from a student services, student affairs background with an instructional design type of influence, I wanted to make sure that we're highlighting all the professional organizations that can also help with these free online trainings as well. So yes, you can look within your organization, your institution, but you can also look outside to those professional organizations, and then also social media, and the bubble just keeps getting bigger. So this example is about equity-minded student services and online learning environments, but then there's also equity-minded strategies for virtual communities. So what I'm going to do is also share these links, but again, these are all on the resources link that I shared a little bit earlier. So the idea is that we all first need to do that work to understand what our worldview is, so that then we can intentionally design for something more inclusive for all of our learners. And number two, the tip number two is build a sense of community. So in this tip, what we're really thinking about is holding space for diverse identities and values to be present in your online environment. So what does this mean exactly? To hold space for diverse identities and values to be present and valued. When you're talking about an online course, it could look like a number of things, but here are a few strategies to consider. Feel free to read the slide. I'll give you a little bit of time and pause, and then we'll go into each of those examples. All right, so for some of the examples that I have here is just using video or audio to introduce yourself and your team. Record a tour of your office or a quick hello when you send an email. Loom is one of my favorite tools where it shows your screen or it records your voice. And that's the best way for me, I believe, to give feedback, because I am verbose, as you all have noticed. I want to make sure that my students and my learners can hear my voice inflection as I'm giving feedback to maybe a writing assignment. The next is use technologies that provide freedom or a space to students to be creative. So find ways that students can work outside that linear learning structure and still complete the overall learning objectives. In Indigenous cultures, storytelling is a way of teaching and learning, which is a less linear approach than formal instructional design principles that are kind of like explain, example, practice, right? If you provide the space for learners who are used to that kind of nonlinear pathway to move outside the lines while they're learning, it's a little bit easier for them to process the information and navigate the academic learning environment. So the other part is really hard because you can't like create time, but you can make the time for your values. So when you're building a sense of community, you need to make time to get to know your learners and have them connect with each other. And this can be synchronous, asynchronous, an icebreaker activity before you get started. But anything that allows that space for your learners to feel that sense of belonging with each other and feel connected with each other. You can build a sense of community by actively facilitating classes, workshops, discussions in ways that raise voices for those learners who are not really the majority. And you can do this by not quite calling out the learners in discussions, but you're recognizing individual strengths of your learners and what they bring to the discussion. Or you could give shout outs or kudos to multiple learners who brought up differing perspectives and kind of ignite the conversation and the engagement from there. All right, so this is my example, Miro. For those of you who have not used Miro, it's kind of like a Jamboard, but it's almost like a never-ending whiteboard space for you to create things. So the example here is that we had a peer leader training, and we stopped after, doing our normal updates and training pieces, and we used the last bit of time to help everyone share appreciation for each other in a space that was a little bit more open and creative. What's interesting is that you don't see the end result of this, but the end result had a lot of emojis, a lot of GIFs, because once you give the learners, a chance to have fun and create and show their personality, it tends to come through. Miro is also a really good tool for doing a wireframe of ePortfolios for those of you who are working on high impact practices in terms of ePortfolios. It's a good way to kind of get your more creative thoughts out. And it's, like I said, that less linear approach. But another example for maybe an open-ended, more creative process is mind mapping instead of just wanting an outline for a writing intensive course. So being open to accepting different types of assignments that can be their assessment for learning. And then really, honestly, the whole idea is just to set the table and give space for your learners. And I'm sure they'll surprise you and be really appreciative of this space because they can thrive in that particular high impact practice. But the point is giving options and thinking outside of the box of what those may be. Right, and then here's another example of building a sense of community. So beyond discussion boards, there are different ways to actually raise students' voices and give a platform to their experiences. So in my last university position, I created a podcast for students to share their experiences and advice for other students whenever they were working through, that graduate school application process, which can be a long, lengthy, difficult process. So for example, in one of the podcasts, I was talking to a student who had just visited potential graduate school campuses, and they met with potential faculty advisors that they might want to work with. And in that particular podcast, the student actually provided the exact questions because she brought her portfolio and read out some of the questions that she asked some of her graduate faculty. And it was just a place to help get, remove the stigma and get to the point where, this is important to me. And I had the audacity to actually ask this. And you should be able to ask this question as well to get your needs met. And that was one of the most transformational, I think, conversations that we had for some of the students that came in after that student, to say, I was always, really worried and anxious about asking questions that were really important to me, because it felt like I didn't have a leg to stand on when I was asking those questions. So in this way, using this podcast or using an audio place to lift up some students who have been through that process will then pave the way for students who come after them. But, in various classrooms or programs for high impact practices, the context will always be different. But the tips that I'm providing, I believe, can then be used throughout each of the HIPs or the high impact practices. And that brings us to tip number 3, representation matters. What I love is that the last presentation that I was in, they also talked about this and gave a lot of really great resources to help with representation. So visually representing students. Now, the one caveat that I have here is that we want high impact practices to depict their students of their program and be authentic about that representation. So canned DEI images are fine, especially if you have, students from your institution and that's a repository that your institution is using. That's great, but it can sometimes feel inauthentic from the students who are actually in your programs to see this person represented that they don't know their story and they don't know how things came to be. So my suggestion is, yes, definitely, if you don't have any images at all, please use some inclusive repositories of images. However, what I want to advocate for is that we want to make sure that we're taking time and we show authentic visually representation of the students who have been working through the high impact practices that you use. So to see those real images, some of my examples are to start thinking about a pre-made photo release form that you might have from your marketing department maybe, and to track that down online or email someone in your marketing department to say, do you have a model release or a photo release form that I could use? At the beginning of the high impact practices that I managed or coordinated, I always asked our students to sign that at the beginning, or if it was an HIP within a course, I asked them after the fact to say, hey, can I use your examples? Also, may I get an image of you that you might, that you would approve? And in order to do that, we also need you to complete this form as well. But I didn't quite have to create the model release. I'm not a lawyer, so I was able to find one through a marketing place. I mean, and some example for some other high impact practices. So let's say you coordinate internships. And you might be able to work with your career center to hire a professional photographer that will take headshots. And here it's a win-win situation where the students have an appropriate LinkedIn profile image maybe, and then you also get to spotlight your students on the website or social media pages at the same time. So then that's that authentic images, right? And if you coordinate maybe like a learning community or a service learning project, you could have the students at the end of the semester create a short video of advice for the next cohort. All of this is important to think about as you start to figure out how to visually represent your high impact practice and to be able almost to market and recruit more diverse students to engage in your HIP. So as an example of, again, from some of the work that I've done, Flipgrid videos were the easiest thing for me to ask for student leaders and graduates to do voiceovers of like how-to videos in order for them to show like descriptions of our services, to do like advertising messages that I could use on social media to market our high impact practice. And then I was able to then download them, use them on our official YouTube page, and then put them in videos and online courses or put them on our website. But for Flipgrid, basically what I did was that I set out, here are the instructions, here are the different topic areas. If you could show me a screenshot of what you do and then voice over how you did it, then that would help me kind of put your voice and your experience in further resources for other students rather than me being the person always giving my perspective on how to use something. And that to me is a little bit more valuable and authentic for our students to learn from. All right, and number 4 is equity-minded practices. So be clear, flexible, and responsive to the spoken yet unspoken needs of our students. Now remember, this is a little more active piece of the inclusive online environments. So equity-minded practices means basically practicing your values, being anti-racist, a universal learning designer, and believing in inclusion, and also acting on bringing equity to your online learning environments. And you can do this by modeling behavior that you want to see your learners doing. So maybe, for example, if you have a discussion post in your online LMS, right? And you should think about modeling that behavior by being responsive to those discussion posts and asking questions to provoke more conversation, engagement on a topic, and modeling that curiosity that might make your learners feel a little bit more safe to do. At the same time, instead of just like ticking off the box, like, yeah, I did my 1 discussion post, or I did my 3 replies and I'm done. But if you start kind of being responsive in that pose and asking more pivotal questions, then they'll want to come back and they'll want to be active in those discussions. The next is proactively put a disclaimer in your syllabus or program guidelines to open that dialogue and about maybe needing extra space or time to complete the requirements. And you want to bring that up in your first meeting and your second meeting and your third meeting, however you are meeting with your students asynchronously or synchronously, this reminder should be out there so that it kind of takes the stigma or the shame away from the students for asking for more flexibility. And again, remind students who you believe are experiencing those disproportionate impacts from pandemic and still happening and just life in general, that the option of flexibility is there. So whether it's one-on-one coaching, how to complete the assignment, or the requirements for the high impact practice, you're trying to find ways to reach out to remind those learners that that type of conversation is open for discussion. And again, Flipgrid discussion questions. One of my examples for this one is that I was in a class myself because I'm a doctoral student, and instead of doing like written discussion on a discussion board, we had to participate in Flipgrid discussions, which is an audible voice discussion every single week. And I got sick and I barely had a voice. And I know, ultimately that the instructor would have been totally okay with me saying, hey, can I like participate in some other way? Like, it's just really difficult for me to do this. But I didn't even ask because I was so afraid of them saying, no, you can't just like work through it. But I just worked through it, and that's one of the places that we don't want to put our learners in, because that further marginalizes their experiences and hurts the fact that you want to be there. So that constant reminder actually really helps. And then we want to think empathetically more about like the deadlines for your programs or courses. And are those deadlines there and created for your process or for the student's process? So honestly, think about where you'll be able to give flexibility to those students in terms of deadlines. And maybe that looks like you have maybe like an early bird application that is just like, here's the first deadline. We need you to do the first deadline. And then you have a final deadline for your application for the program as well. And the point is to be proactive in opening the possibility for this flexibility, and to ensure that there's no shame when a student wants to or needs to ask for it when it's imperative for their success in the program. All right, so this is my example. It's a pretty large example. It's an open asynchronous program on Canvas. So like I said, I was a graduate school preparation advisor, and what we ended up doing was creating an open online structured program. For those of you who are familiar with the McNair Scholars Program, that is a Department of Education grant funded in order to help a finite group of students. So this was our way of kind of breaking that and rethinking our ability to share these resources, because we always were thinking in a way that, our resources are finite, the money is finite in order to help support these students. So we started thinking in a different way of how could we offer these resources in a more flexible environment for people who don't fit our little criteria, but could benefit from what we do. So we created this open access online structured program for students at the University of Central Florida. We used videos and assignments that past scholars have created to help advise their peers. We used the structured program and provided almost like an individual development plan by peer mentors and who are actually in the selected programs to be able to mentor those who are in the open access programs. But basically, we were looking into ways that they could pick and choose what they wanted and what they needed to work on. And all they had to do was complete 10 quote assignments by the end of the year to graduate with quote honors, right? And that quote honors, it motivated them a little bit for this to self-direct their learning and to actually finish on time. But the perks were really minimal. It was that we had a free GRE online prep material course that was donated to us by by a GRE prep company. And then we also were able to get, like graduation cords or like a medal that everyone from that open access program, whoever finished it, whether they were a distance learning student or if they were an actual student on our campus, everyone was able to then partake in that and get those materials for their graduation. And that brings us to number 5, our fifth and final tip for today, that we want to make sure that we're evaluating our online environments and asking feedback from our diverse students. All right, so we're all familiar with the concept of evaluation, but sometimes you just don't know how you can improve until you ask, right? And an evaluation could be a place to start exploring the values that you need and the values or the needs of your participants, or it could be the confirmation that the adjustments you made were productive, let's hope, right? But some ways you might be able to do that are through online surveys, one-on-one discussions, exit interviews, anything of the nature of summative feedback, even throughout the actual high impact practice, excuse me. But basically the point is to ask and create that feedback loop with your learners. So this is an example from that course that I mentioned earlier. That was that open access structured program. And what we ended up doing is that we created a final anonymous survey at the end before opening, that certification for the participant. So it wasn't exactly 100% response, but we did get some valuable feedback. And we asked some questions like, what did you gain the most from the program to assess our learning objectives? And then we asked, what could we have done to improve your experience? And from that survey, we actually found that the peer mentor meetings served as almost like gatekeepers in starting the programs, and they were only available during business hours. So what we ended up doing was restructuring the availability of these services to meet the needs of our students' timetables a little bit better in this open, online, asynchronous type of structured program. So I'm no longer currently coordinating this program, but I've heard from some of the peer leaders, because they tell me whenever they get into Princeton or another graduate school, and they still tell me that the assessment is that piece that pushes them to keep those changes happening every semester to help better their experiences. So I'm really glad that we are starting to kind of close this presentation, because we have about 7 minutes left to do this, but this is my review of the 5 tips. Work on your own cultural competence, build a sense of community, representation matters, use equity-minded practices, and evaluate your online environments. So before we move forward, what I would love for you to do is all create some inclusive goals for yourself. And this is just a Google form that no one else is going to use this information but me. But what I like are accountability buddies, which are accountability buddies. I am more than happy to be your accountability buddy. And what I'd like for you all to do is create a goal for yourself to focus on one of these tips and create your high impact practice or your online learning environment, and to be able to create a more inclusive space. So I'm going to give you a little bit of time to do that. As you all are doing that, I am also open to questions. So if you'd like to ask any questions about the information that I have shared today, I am open to start preparing and answering those questions.
And for the participants, you can post a question in the chat, or if you want to unmute yourself and speak, that is fine as well. We have roughly about 7 minutes left, and just want to make sure we extend a thank you to Colleen for her participation and presentation today, as well as her flexibility, because we had a little hiccup there at the beginning. So thank you for doing all the work that I was supposed to do, Colleen. I really appreciate it. And thank you for a great presentation today. So I'm going to hand it back over in case there's any questions, and we'll go from there.
Great, thank you. Thank you all for being here. Yeah, accountability buddies are my favorite term. I'm also very open to connecting with you all on LinkedIn. My information's on the Discord, but it's also here as well. And I have started curating a list of resources on Twitter as well. So if you want to follow me on Twitter, you can see some of those resources as well. Thank you, Laura. Thank you all so much.